Today, we'll be going over one of the most misunderstood mechanics in Union Arena, which is the attack phase. So even though this might seem pretty simple and you may think that you may know all about it, I guarantee that if you watch the entire video, you'll at least learn something new. So what is the attack phase? It's basically the phase between the main phase and the end phase. And in Union Arena, unlike some other games, you have to go through the phases in this specific order, and you can't go back and forth unlike other games. So this is the exact wording from the manual. We won't be going over this, but keep in mind that I'll have some screenshots from the manual in case you want to pause and read over. And this is the next page. So basically, in order for any character to attack, they must be rested. So for instance, this Roy Mustang has a when attacking ability. So when attacking, you will rest this card, and then you can trigger the when attacking ability, which resolves right after the character is rested. So this is especially important for cards such as this 4-cost 1-point Kenshin. So basically you would rest this card to trigger the when attacking ability, and then you place a card into the sideline, and then it turns active right away. So this all happens before your opponent designates a blocker, and of course they will be way before your opponent performs their damage or trigger check. So the timing of this effect is especially important, such as this Modernia that has a when attacking ability that can sideline an opposing character, so that when you rest this character and use its when attacking ability, you would effectively sideline an opposing card before your opponent has a chance to block. And then we'll take some time to look at the snipe mechanic, and I still see people get this wrong. So effectively, snipe does not choose, it targets. So this is very important because we have opposing cards, such as this 2-cost Karu that gives a protection ability against choosing abilities. So basically, snipe doesn't choose, it targets. So this is important in that it will not trigger any of the protection abilities from characters like Karu. And the targeted character is not considered blocking, so it is not rested when the character is targeted by your snipe character. However, it is considered to be entering a battle, so effectively if your card wins the battle, it will trigger any abilities such as Impact 1. And then we'll be going over blockers. So in a very similar fashion, blockers must rest to block. So this happens during the blocker designation phase, which is right after the previous step. So when blocking abilities resolve right after the character is rested. So for instance, this Miwa has an ability to sideline an opposing character when blocking, so that if you are able to sideline the card that your opponent has rested to attack, there will be no battle that will go between Miwa and the attacking character. And then we're going over the attack resolution. So this is the exact page from the manual. So for example, if you, the attacker, has the same or higher BP as your opponent's character, we will see what happens. And in this particular battle, we have our own card, which is the 4-cost Sukuna that has Impact 1, which is an ability that does something when you win a battle. And your opponent has a Kento Nanami that has a win sideline ability. So we'll be looking at exactly what happens when these two characters enter into a battle. So of course, your Sukuna must rest to attack, and then your opponent's Kento Nanami must rest to block. And then what happens next? We will go into what is basically the BP comparison step, or the damage calculation step if you're familiar with Yu-Gi-Oh! And in this sequence, your 4000 BP character versus their 4000 BP character are the same BP, so the Sukuna wins the battle, and then Nanami is considered sideline, and his when sideline ability resolves fully. After that, you will resolve any abilities that say when you win a battle. So for this instance, Sukuna triggers his Impact 1 ability, which deals 1 damage to your opponent. So what happens if you have this card that has Impact 3? So for example, your 15-cost Saitama has an Impact 3 ability. So Impact 3 says that if you attack and win a battle, you will deal 3 damage to your opponent. And what happens when you face an Arthur? Basically any character that has Nullify Impact. So Nullify Impact will remove all instances of impact from your character. So no matter if you have Impact 2, Impact 3, Impact 4, it will all go down to 0 if your opponent blocks it with a Nullify Impact ability. And now what happens if you, the attacker, have less BP? So then if your opponent blocks and they have higher BP than your attacking character is considered to have lost the battle. So most importantly, your attacking character is not sidelined after losing a battle since it is your turn, but you will resolve any abilities that activate when your character attacks and loses the battle. So far, I don't think any of these abilities exist, and you will also resolve any of your opponent's abilities that activate when they win a battle. But notably, none of these abilities exist since Impact 1 requires that they attack and win a battle. So we'll be looking at if you attack and your opponent does not block. So for example, our 4-cost 1-point Izumi says when this character attacks and is not blocked, draw a card. So let's go through the steps again. You rest your Izumi to declare an attack. and your opponent says, I'm not going to block. So it would trigger your Izumi's ability, which allows you to draw a card, and this happens before dealing 1 damage or the trigger check. So effectively, you'll draw a card before your opponent flips a card for their damage. And now we're looking at what happens if you have damage 2. So damage 2 is the ability that if you deal damage to your opponent, you'll be dealing 2 damage instead of 1. And most importantly, this damage happens simultaneously. So what happens is that the 2 lives are flipped at the same time, and your opponent actually has the ability to choose the order of trigger ability resolution. So why is this important? We'll be going over that. Well, this is important, for example, if you flip these 2 cards. So the sequence of which your opponent triggers these is very important because it is actually better to resolve the Suzaku first, because this has a get trigger, so it will be able to add the card to your opponent's hand. And then after, they'll resolve the color trigger, which is the green color trigger, which will allow them to play the 0 cost onto their field, active. If you had done it the other order, if you had no cards to play with the green color trigger in your hand, because the 0 cost Suzaku was not in the hand yet, the color trigger would fizzle, so you would be effectively wasting the color trigger. And then we'll be looking at what it means to be the end of the attack. So for example, the 5 cost Kirito has an ability that says at the end of this character's attack, you may swap it with an Asuna on your energy line. So the end of the attack is after all the steps are done, so that means after the life trigger check. So unfortunately, if you attack with the Kirito and your opponent flips up a special trigger, sidelining your Kirito, you cannot use this Kirito to swap it with an Asuna on your energy line. And now we have another scenario that involves the attack phase, and this is the 6 cost 1 action point Levi. So this card is a bit confusing because it has both double attack, but it also has the ability at the end of this character's attack, you may pay 1 AP. If you do, to switch this character to active. So note that double attack can only trigger if it is the first time this character attacks. So notably, you do not want to pay an AP to switch this character active on its first attack. And also, the ability to pay 1 AP is at the end of this character's attack. So just like the Kirito, it is after the trigger check. So what happens at the end of the attack phase? So there are actually cards that activate at the end of your attack phase. So it is very important to remember this part if you play the 3 cost 1 action point Kaoru. So this step happens before all your cards are turned active at the end of your turn. So let's recap. So basically, whenever you want to attack, you must rest to attack. And then your when attacking abilities resolve. And then your opponent has a chance to designate a blocker, in which they must rest to block. And then they would resolve all their when blocking abilities. And then after, you compare BP and determine the battle winner between those 2 cards. And then after doing so, you would sideline an opposing character if your card has won the battle, but not if you, the attacker, have lost the battle. And then if their opposing card is considered sideline, you would resolve all when sideline abilities. And then after, you would resolve any abilities that say when you win a battle, such as Impact 1. Alright, thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more videos.